On the morning Elara turned 16, the world shifted in ways she could never have imagined. She woke, as she always did, to the gentle chiming of crystal bells that hung from the towers of her family's castle, their pure tones drifting through the enchanted valleys of Ethermore. The morning light filtered through her windows in ribbons of gold and violet, touched by the ancient magic that thrummed beneath the soil of this wondrous realm. It was her birthday, and though she'd celebrated many before, something felt different this year. Something whispered at the edges of her awareness, like a secret waiting to be discovered. Elara rose from her bed of silk and moonflower down, her bare feet touching the cool marble floor. She padded to her window and gazed out across the kingdom she would one day rule. Below her lay crystalline mountains that caught the sunlight and threw it back in dancing rainbows. Forests of ancient trees swayed gently, their leaves shimmering between green and silver as the magic coursing through their roots made them shimmer with life. Villages nestled in the valleys looked peaceful and small, their thatched roofs like a child's toys scattered across green velvet. It was a perfect kingdom, blessed and serene. Yet as Elara studied the distant horizons beyond her beloved realm, she thought she glimpsed something troubling. There, where the crystalline mountains gave way to shadowed lands beyond Ethermore's borders, the sky seemed darker than it should. A faint mist hung there, growing thicker each passing season according to whispers she'd heard the court advisors exchange in hushed tones. They spoke of Malachar, a sorcerer whose name was rarely mentioned above a whisper, and an army that grew with each passing moon. But this morning, such troubles felt far away. Elara turned from the window and began her day as she always did, dressing in the silver gown her mother had commissioned for the occasion. As she fastened the delicate clasps at her wrists, something extraordinary happened. The ancient symbols embroidered into the cuffs began to glow. Elara gasped and held her hands before her face. The runes, decorative patterns she'd never given much thought to, blazed with emerald light that seemed to flow from somewhere deep within her own skin. The glow spread across her palms and fingers, dancing like living flames that gave off warmth but caused no pain. She watched in wonder as the symbols rearranged themselves, glowing brighter, becoming intricate patterns she'd never seen before. They were beautiful and terrifying, ancient and alive. Before she could cry out, a knock sounded at her door. Her grandmother entered without waiting for permission, as was her right. The court mage moved with the grace of someone who had walked this earth for many centuries, her silver robes flowing behind her like water. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, immediately found Elara's illuminated hands. The old woman did not look surprised. Instead, she smiled, and in that smile was both joy and a profound sadness. "They are awakening," her grandmother whispered, approaching Elara and taking her glowing hands gently. "Oh, my dear child, I had hoped we would have more time, but the magic has chosen this day." "Grandmother, what's happening to me?" Elara asked, her voice trembling. "What's happening is what was always meant to be. You are not merely a princess, Elara. You are a wizard, born with power that has slumbered since your conception. Today, on your 16th year, the magic recognizes you as ready. These runes are ancient, older than our kingdom, older than memory. They mark you as one chosen for greatness, for trials that will test the very essence of your soul." She squeezed Elara's hands gently. "There are shadows gathering beyond our borders, child. Darkness that grows stronger with each passing season. The magic chose its moment to awaken, because darkness chooses its moments too. You are meant for this. You were born for this." As the last rays of sunset painted the castle gold, Elara whispered to herself, "Everything changes tonight." The Tower of Starlight had been waiting for her arrival for centuries, though she did not yet know it. Elara's footsteps echoed softly against the spiral staircase as she climbed toward the uppermost chamber where her grandmother awaited. The ancient stone walls seemed to hum with anticipation, and pale moonlight filtered through narrow windows, casting silver threads across her path. When she entered the circular tower room, Elara's breath caught. The ceiling opened to the night sky, and stars wheeled overhead in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost like they were watching. Candles floated at various heights throughout the space, their flames burning in colors she had never seen before: deep violet, soft gold, and crystalline blue. Her grandmother stood at the room's center, robed in midnight silk that seemed to ripple like water. Grandmother Seraphine's eyes held the warmth of 1,000 hearth fires, and when she smiled, the worry lines around her mouth softened. "You came," Seraphine said simply, though something deeper resonated in those two words. "I promised," Elara replied, stepping fully into the chamber. "And promises matter. They are the first lesson, though you won't fully understand why until much later." Grandmother gestured for her to come closer. "Magic is not found in wands or spoken words alone. Dear one, magic lives in intention. It flows through every being who has ever loved deeply, hoped fiercely, or grieved truly. You have done all three, haven't you?" Elara nodded slowly, thinking of the soldiers who guarded her, the kingdom she was learning to love, and the weight of responsibility that sometimes pressed upon her small shoulders. "Then you already understand more than you realize." Seraphine took her granddaughter's hands, and Elara felt warmth bloom between their palms, golden and alive. "Close your eyes." In the darkness behind her eyelids, Elara sensed light moving like liquid through her fingers, warming her wrists, flowing up her arms. It felt like coming home after a long journey. It felt like remembering something she'd always known. "Do you feel it?" her grandmother whispered. "Yes. What is it?" "That is your thread. Every person born to magic has one. Yours is particularly bright." Seraphine released her hands gently. "Open your eyes." Elara looked down and gasped. A faint luminescence traced along her skin, golden and pulsing with her heartbeat. It faded after a moment, but the memory of its presence remained vivid within her. "With practice, you will learn to draw upon it, to weave it with intention into the world around you. But first, you must understand that magic asks questions of your heart. If you cast a spell with anger, it will taste of anger. If you cast with compassion, it becomes compassionate." Seraphine moved to a table where ancient scrolls lay unfurled. "This grimoire contains the first incantation, taught to every mage in our lineage. It is not meant to do anything grand or powerful. It is meant to teach you balance." She guided Elara through the words carefully, each syllable a small bridge between thought and manifestation. Her grandmother made her repeat them dozens of times, slowly, with attention paid not to speed, but to feeling. How did each word settle in her chest? What emotion colored it? Then, as the night deepened, and the stars shifted their positions overhead, her grandmother withdrew her guidance. Elara stood alone, holding the scroll in trembling hands. The chamber seemed to hold its breath with her. She began the incantation again, and this time something different happened. The words no longer felt foreign on her tongue. They felt ancestral, as though 100 generations of magic weavers were speaking through her. The golden light returned to her skin, brighter now, and the floating candles brightened in response. Around her, the air shimmered. Shadows became visible in new ways, revealing their texture and depth. The darkness held meaning now, not emptiness. It was a canvas waiting for light, a silence waiting for sound. When the final word left her lips, Elara opened eyes she didn't remember closing and found her grandmother weeping with pride. "You are ready," Seraphine said, "more ready than I dared hope." Elara felt transformed, though nothing about her appearance had changed. With each word of the ancient incantation, Elara felt less like a girl playing with magic, and more like magic itself. The messenger arrived at midnight, his horse foam-flecked and trembling with exhaustion. He stumbled through the great doors of the castle, his cloak dripping with something that looked like rain, but smelled of winter and decay. The guards caught him as his knees buckled, and they carried him to the throne room where King Aldrin sat in his high seat, roused from his chambers by the commotion. The messenger's words came in gasps, and trembling breaths. Villages along the eastern border were disappearing into shadow, he said, not burning, not destroyed by visible force, but consumed by an encroaching darkness that moved like a living thing. The creatures that emerged from this shadow were things without proper form, neither beast nor demon, but something that defied the mind's ability to comprehend them. People simply vanished within it, and those who escaped spoke only in whispers of what they had glimpsed. The king listened with a furrowed brow, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of his throne. He had ruled Ethermore for 30 years with wisdom and justice, but he was a practical man. Shadows were not armies. Creatures of uncertain shape could be tricks of fear and exhaustion. He ordered the messenger given food and rest, dispatched scouts to investigate, but his tone suggested he expected a report of natural phenomena or bandits, not the encroaching evil the frightened man described. In the gallery above the throne room, Elara watched and listened. She had felt it drawing near for weeks now, a wrongness at the edges of her perception, like a sound just below hearing or a smell carried on distant wind. When the court mages arrived at dawn, summoned by the king's cautious inquiry, she felt it even more strongly. The 3 mages conferred in hushed voices, their ancient eyes reflecting knowledge that most mortals were never meant to possess. The eldest, Mage Soren, approached the throne with deliberate slowness. "Your Majesty," he said, and his voice held the weight of centuries. "What your messenger describes aligns with warnings from texts we thought were merely legend. There is an ancient evil stirring in the world. The shadow he speaks of bears the mark of Malachar's work." The name seemed to ripple through the throne room like a stone cast into still water. Malachar, whose dark sorcery had nearly consumed the kingdoms 1,000 years past, before the great mages bound him in sleep. But even as Soren spoke, the king's expression remained skeptical, his faith in the tangible world stronger than his belief in old tales. "Statues and sentries," he commanded. "Post guards along the border. Investigate these villages thoroughly, but I will not panic the kingdom over shadows and rumors." Elara felt a strange sensation bloom within her chest, neither fear nor certainty, but a pulling sensation like the tide responding to the moon's invisible call. The magic within her, awakened by her secret studies, seemed to stir in response to the mention of that ancient name. That night, after the castle had grown quiet and the servants had retreated to their chambers, she found herself drawn to the tower library where the oldest texts were kept. The books seemed to call to her, their leather spines worn by countless hands over countless years. She pulled volumes at random, reading by candlelight about the Shadow Wars, about creatures born from malice given form, about a sorcerer whose ambition had nearly unmade the world itself. With each page, her understanding deepened and expanded. The magic within her recognized kinship with these ancient words, as if they had been waiting for someone to speak them aloud once more. But beneath the knowledge lay something else, something that made her hands tremble as she held the fragile pages. A terrible understanding was beginning to form. The feeling she had sensed was not distant anymore. It was drawing closer with each passing hour, and no matter how many guards the king positioned or scouts he sent forth, they would not be able to stop what was coming unless someone understood it, unless someone felt it as she did. That night, Elara lay awake listening to the wind howl, wondering if it carried warnings from the east. The sky split open with a terrible cry that shook the very foundations of the castle. Elara bolted upright in her bed, her heart racing as the sound echoed through the stone corridors like nothing she had ever heard before. It was neither human nor animal, but something caught between worlds, a wail of anguish and urgency that seemed to pierce directly into her soul. The wind that had kept her awake all night suddenly turned violent, rattling the diamond-paned windows of her chamber as though desperate hands were trying to break through. She threw on her robe and rushed to the balcony, her feet barely touching the cold floor. Below, in the vast courtyard where servants had once danced at summer festivals, something massive was descending from the turbulent sky. Golden feathers, each one the size of a man's hand, caught what little moonlight penetrated the dark clouds. The creature crashed onto the stone courtyard with tremendous force, and the impact sent showers of sparks scattering across the ground like falling stars. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She had read about griffins in the ancient texts, those magnificent beings that belonged to myth and legend. Yet here was one, real and immediate, its eagle head held high despite the evident exhaustion in its movement. Its lion's body was heaving, golden fur matted in places with something dark that might have been ash or something far more sinister. Without thinking, Elara ran. Her servants called after her, but she could not be stopped. She descended the spiral stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding in rhythm with her feet. The courtyard doors swung open before her, as though moved by invisible hands, and she stepped out into the cold night air. The griffin's eyes found her immediately, and in them burned an intelligence that transcended the animal. The creature's gaze held recognition, as though it knew exactly who she was and had come specifically for her. "You are Elara," the griffin said, its voice like distant thunder rolling across mountains. "The one they call Princess. I am Solaris, guardian of the eastern reaches, and I bring dire tidings from the lands beyond the Obsidian Ridge." Elara stood frozen, unable to process that she was hearing words, real words, from a creature of legend. But somehow it felt natural, as though part of her had always known this moment would come. "The darkness rises," Solaris continued, his great head turning toward the east. "The sorcerer Malachar has gathered his shadow army, wraiths and corrupted beings that feed on light itself. They march toward Ethermore with terrible purpose. The kingdoms to the east have already fallen. The forests weep. The mountains themselves tremble. Why have you come to me?" Elara whispered, though somewhere deep within her she sensed the answer. "Because you are the light bearer," Solaris said, lowering himself so that his massive golden head was level with hers. "The prophecies written in the oldest stones speak of one born under the constellation of Lumina, one whose very presence can hold back the creeping darkness. That is you, Elara. You are the one who must stand against Malachar's advance." The weight of those words settled upon her shoulders like a physical thing. All her life, she had felt different, marked somehow by something she could never quite name. The strange warmth that sometimes flowed from her fingertips when she touched wounded creatures. The way darkness seemed to pause in her presence. The dreams of light and battle and sacrifice that had haunted her nights. "I will help you," Solaris said, his voice softening slightly. "I will guide you through the trials ahead, help you discover the power that lies dormant within you. But you must be willing to embrace your destiny. Elara, the path ahead will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." Elara looked into the griffin's ancient eyes and saw not judgment, but hope. She thought of the wind that had kept her awake, carrying warnings from the east. She thought of all the moments in her life that had led her to this precise instant. "I accept," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I will fight for Ethermore." Elara placed her hand upon Solaris's warm feathers and felt, for the first time, the weight of true responsibility. The library's deepest chamber had not been entered in 700 years, and the dust motes danced like spirits in Elara's candlelight. She descended the spiral stairs slowly, her grandmother's map clutched in one trembling hand, while the other held high a candle that cast dancing shadows against ancient stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, and her breath began to form delicate clouds before her face. The weight of responsibility that had settled upon her shoulders when she touched Solaris's feathers seemed to grow heavier still, pressing down like an invisible cloak woven from duty and destiny. The chamber opened before her, like the yawning mouth of some vast creature. Shelves stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness that the candlelight could not penetrate. Books lined every surface, their spines worn to near illegibility by centuries of silence. Some volumes were so ancient, their leather bindings had cracked and faded to shades of gray and deep brown, while others seemed to glow with a faint luminescence, as if the magic contained within them still pulsed with life. Elara's eyes adjusted to the gloom as she moved deeper into the labyrinth of knowledge. The map had guided her to this place, to these restricted depths where only the most powerful spells lay waiting. Her grandmother's careful notes in the margins promised that here, somewhere within this vast collection, existed the very enchantments that might turn the tide against Malachar's shadow army. She ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles written in languages both familiar and strange. The Codex of Luminous Barriers, Incantations of the First Age, the Compendium of Light Magic. Her heart quickened with each discovery. These were not mere books. These were repositories of power, vessels containing centuries of accumulated wisdom and arcane knowledge. Then she saw it, a grimoire bound in silver-white leather, practically glowing in the candlelight as though it had been waiting for her arrival. Her hands shook as she carefully withdrew it from its resting place. The moment her fingers touched its cover, warmth flooded through her, and she felt the unmistakable tingle of pure magic responding to her presence. She carried it to a nearby reading table, one of the few pieces of furniture in this forgotten place. Dust rose in clouds as she gently opened the cover, revealing pages yellowed with age, but still perfectly preserved. The first entry was written in her grandmother's own hand, an inscription that began with words of greeting and ended with an imperative to read, to memorize, to let the knowledge sink not just into her mind, but into her very soul. The spells contained within were extraordinary, protective enchantments that formed shields of brilliant light, wards that could repel shadow and darkness, incantations that would strengthen her magical reserves and amplify her natural abilities. Each page contained detailed instructions, carefully drawn symbols and diagrams, annotations explaining the proper pronunciation and visualization required for each working. As Elara read, something remarkable began to happen. With each word she spoke aloud, her voice echoing softly through the chamber, she felt her connection to the magic around her deepen and expand. The candle flame grew brighter, burning with a steady golden light. The dust motes in the air seemed to settle and arrange themselves in patterns, as though responding to the ancient words of power. She lost track of time, moving from spell to spell, her fingers tracing the intricate runes and symbols, her lips forming the words of power that made the very air around her shimmer and sing. She could feel her magical reserves building, growing stronger and more resilient with each incantation she studied. It was as though generations of accumulated knowledge were flowing directly into her being, merging with her own innate power. The weight she carried felt different now, less like a burden and more like strength, like armor forged from light and ancient wisdom. She thought of Solaris waiting for her above, of the kingdom beyond these walls, of all those depending upon her success. The night deepened around her, silent and still, as she continued to turn the pages of this precious grimoire. Page after page revealed secrets that set her heart racing with both fear and exhilaration.
The whispering forest welcomed her with 1,000 soft voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Elara stepped carefully between the towering trees, their bark silver in the moonlight, their branches reaching down like gentle hands. The air itself felt alive here, tingling against her skin, carrying scents of wild honeysuckle and ancient earth. She had come alone, as the forest demanded, leaving behind her guards and attendants in the crystalline halls of the kingdom she sought to protect. Her footsteps made no sound on the moss-covered ground. The forest seemed to absorb her presence, to welcome her into its deepest confidence. She moved toward the clearing at the heart of the wood, where the great council gathered only in times of great need. The secrets she had discovered in those dusty pages had led her here, had whispered to her that only the creatures of Ethermore possessed the ancient magic necessary to stand against Malachar's shadow army. The clearing opened before her like a held breath released. Moonlight poured down through a perfect circle in the canopy above, illuminating a space untouched by time. Around its perimeter stood the council, each creature more magnificent than the last. The great silver stag stood at the north point, his antlers catching the light like crystalline spires. His eyes held the weight of centuries, watching her with an intensity that made her knees tremble. To the east, the owls perched in solemn silence, their enormous eyes unblinking, their feathers ruffled with what might have been suspicion or merely the evening breeze. The wolves emerged from the shadows to the south and west, their silver fur rippling like water, their jaws strong enough to crush stone, their voices ready to speak the riddles that only they understood. Elara walked to the center of the clearing and knelt. It was important that she not stand above them, not position herself as superior. This was not a kingdom where hierarchy determined worth. Here in this sacred place, all creatures held power equal and absolute. "I have come seeking your aid," she began, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "A darkness spreads across Ethermore, commanded by one who seeks to conquer all lands and bend all creatures to his will. The shadow grows stronger each day, and soon it will reach even this forest. I come not as a princess demanding allegiance, but as a daughter of this realm asking for your protection of the home we share." The ancient stag stepped forward, his breathing deep and ceremonial. When he spoke, his voice resonated from somewhere beneath the earth itself. "Why should the creatures of Ethermore trust the humans who have hunted and caged us since time immemorial?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Elara felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not look away from that ancient gaze. "Because I have seen the error in that history. Because I hold no chains and seek no cages. Because the darkness that threatens you threatens me equally, and we cannot survive divided when united we have strength." She reached into her satchel and withdrew the pages she had discovered, the ones that spoke of the original covenant between humans and creatures, written in an age when magic flowed freely and kingdoms lived in harmony. She spread them on the moss before the council, and as if responding to the touch of those ancient words, the pages began to glow with a soft, golden light. One by one, the creatures approached. The owls descended silently, reading with eyes that perceived far more than words on paper. The wolves circled, their intelligent faces contemplative, their riddle-speaking voices murmuring in tones too low to hear clearly. The great stag knelt, his magnificent head bowing over the texts, acknowledging the truth contained therein. Hours passed in sacred silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath with Elara, waiting for the decision that would determine the fate of all Ethermore. Finally, the stag rose, and one by one, each creature made their choice. They would stand with her. They would fight the shadow. They would trust that this human princess spoke truth. As the creatures bowed their heads in unified agreement, Elara realized she had become something more than a princess. She had become a leader. The training grounds of the castle's inner courtyard became Elara's second home, her sanctuary of sweat and determination. Each morning before dawn broke across the crystalline peaks of Ethermore, she would venture into this ancient place where the stones themselves seemed to hum with dormant power. The mages had marked the ground with intricate runes that glowed softly in the pale light, each one designed to contain and amplify magical energy. It was here that Elara would discover whether she possessed the strength to save her realm, or whether she would crumble beneath the weight of her own inadequacy. Master Aldwin, the eldest of the royal mages, stood before her with his silver beard flowing like moonlight and his eyes reflecting centuries of accumulated wisdom. His voice was measured and calm as he explained the fundamentals of protective barriers, the invisible walls of pure intention that could shield against darkness itself. Elara listened intently, her fingers curling and uncurling as she prepared her mind for the work ahead. The first attempts were clumsy and fragile, shattering like thin ice the moment any real pressure was applied against them. Day after day, she returned to the courtyard. Her arms ached from maintaining the spell configurations. Her mind grew weary from holding multiple layers of magical intent simultaneously. The other apprentices, younger and less burdened by crown and kingdom, progressed faster than she did. This realization stung more sharply than any magical backlash could have. Yet Elara refused to allow frustration to consume her. Instead, she channeled it into deeper focus, into a quiet determination that settled in her bones. Master Aldwin taught her that true magic did not flow from words alone, nor from the elaborate hand gestures that seemed so important to lesser practitioners. Real power, he explained in his gentle way, emerged from absolute conviction. A mage must believe so thoroughly in their intention that doubt could find no purchase in their mind. Elara began to understand this principle in the depths of her being, not merely intellectually but spiritually. She spent long evenings in the library with dusty tomes, studying the ancient histories of Ethermore's greatest defenders. She learned how they had cultivated their inner strength through meditation, through breathing exercises that synchronized body and spirit. She discovered that the mages of old had viewed their craft not as combat, but as conversation between their will and the world itself. This perspective shifted something fundamental within her approach. The training intensified as autumn deepened. Elara practiced maintaining barriers while dodging enchanted projectiles. She learned to weave multiple protective spells simultaneously, creating layered defenses that would require immense power to penetrate. Her body grew leaner and stronger. Her mind became sharper, more disciplined. The whispers of self-doubt that had plagued her in the beginning began to fade, replaced by a quiet knowing that settled like bedrock beneath her consciousness. One particular morning arrived when everything felt different. The runes on the ground seemed to sing with particular clarity. The air itself felt electric with possibility. Master Aldwin set the most demanding challenge yet, requesting that she maintain a perfect defensive sphere while 3 senior mages assailed it from different directions with increasingly powerful spells. The first minutes were manageable, then the 5th, then the 10th. Pain bloomed behind her eyes as she poured more and more of herself into holding the barrier stable. But something remarkable happened as she continued. The pain transformed into clarity. Her breath became rhythmic and centered. The sphere of light she had created began to glow with an ethereal luminescence that had not been present in her earlier attempts. It was no longer merely a defensive structure built from conscious effort. It had become an extension of her very being, a manifestation of her will made visible to all who watched. The sphere held unwavering and strong. Minutes turned into 30 minutes, then into an hour. When Master Aldwin finally signaled for her to release the spell, Elara lowered her hands slowly, breathing deeply into the profound quiet that followed. Her companions stared at her with expressions between wonder and respect. The mage master approached her with a rare smile crossing his ancient features. When she finally held a perfect defensive sphere of light for an hour without wavering, she understood that transformation had truly begun. The horn of retreat sounded 3 times, a sound no one in the kingdom had heard in 3 generations. Its mournful wail echoed through the marble halls of the castle, reverberating through every stone corridor and chamber, carrying with it the weight of terrible tidings. Elara stood at the eastern tower window, watching as messenger ravens circled overhead in desperate patterns, their black wings cutting through the pale morning sky. The scouts had returned, and they brought news that froze the blood in every loyal subject's veins. The Shadow Army had crossed the border. It was no longer a distant threat whispered about in nervous councils. It was here, moving through the borderlands like a creeping stain, consuming everything in its path. Entire villages had fallen silent. Forests that had stood for millennia were withering as if all their life force had been drawn away in moments. The darkness moved not like an ordinary army, but like a living thing, conscious and ravenous, eating light and hope as it advanced. Elara descended the spiral stairs toward the war chamber, her heart beating with urgent rhythm. The halls seemed darker today, as though fear itself was dimming the magical torches that lined the passages. Guards stood at attention, their faces etched with concern that they could no longer hide behind practiced stoicism. The kingdom was preparing for war in earnest now, not as a distant preparation, but as an immediate necessity. In the war chamber, generals bent over maps with furrowed brows. Red markers indicated the shadow army's positions, spreading across the landscape like a disease. The commander of the guard, an old warrior named Thuron with silver in his beard and scars telling stories of countless battles, looked up as Elara entered. His expression was grim, determined, but the worry in his eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. "The darkness moves faster than we anticipated," Thuron said, his voice steady but heavy. "At this pace, they will reach the kingdom's heart in less than 2 weeks. We are fortifying the outer settlements, but we cannot save them all." Elara felt the weight of his words settle upon her shoulders. She thought of the transformation she had completed just yesterday, of that perfect sphere of light she had held for an hour without wavering. It had felt like such a triumph then, a sign that she was becoming something more than she had been. But standing here now, looking at the advancing markers of shadow on the map, that accomplishment felt suddenly insufficient. The training, the gradual progression, the careful building of power, it all felt too slow, too methodical for a crisis that was unfolding at such terrifying speed. The generals began discussing defensive strategies, proposing walls and barriers, talking of where to make their stand. But Elara's mind was working differently. She thought of the allies scattered throughout Ethermore, the dragon clan in the northern peaks, the merfolk in the crystal lakes, the ancient tree spirits in the deepest forests, the sky dancers who dwelled among the clouds. Each possessed powers that could turn the tide, but they were far away, and there was no time to wait for them to arrive on their own. Her hands trembled slightly as she studied the map, tracing the paths of darkness spreading like fingers across the landscape. She had been so focused on her own growth, on mastering her abilities within the safety of the castle walls, but Malachar's darkness was not waiting for her to feel ready. The shadows did not care about timelines or careful progressions. They simply consumed. Thuron placed a weathered hand on her shoulder. "What are you thinking, princess? Your expression has changed." Elara looked at the map of advancing shadows and made a decision that would change everything. She would not wait for battle to come to her. The descent into the earth was a descent into the heartbeat of the world itself, each step taking her deeper into ancient time. Elara moved carefully down the stone pathway, her torch casting dancing shadows against walls that glimmered with veins of crystal that seemed to pulse with their own gentle luminescence. The air grew cooler as she descended, carrying with it the scent of minerals and something older still, something that spoke of ages long forgotten by the world above. Around her, the cavern walls revealed themselves in all their splendor. Crystals of impossible size jutted from the stone surfaces, some as tall as trees, their surfaces catching and refracting the light of her torch into 1,000 shimmering fragments. It was as though she walked through starlight made solid, through the very essence of the earth's ancient magic crystallized into form. The passage sloped downward in a gentle spiral, and with each turn the air seemed to thicken with anticipation, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something significant to occur. The forest creatures had taught her the song before she ventured into the darkness. She could still hear their gentle voices in her memory, the melodic words they had gifted her in a language far older than any human tongue. It was a song of awakening, of renewal, of calling to something precious from the depths of slumber. They had warned her that the dragon Embereth had slept for 4 centuries, ever since the last age of darkness had been driven back, and that only the ancient melody could stir such a being from dreams that span generations. At last, the passage opened into an enormous chamber that took Elara's breath away. The cavern was vast beyond measure, its ceiling lost in shadow despite her torch's light. The floor was smooth and polished, worn by countless years into a mirror of stone. And there, in the very center of this magnificent space, coiled upon itself in a nest of crystalline formations, lay the dragon. Embereth was enormous, a creature that seemed to belong more to legend than to any reality Elara had ever known. Her scales caught the torchlight and threw it back in shades of deep crimson and gold, colors that seemed to hold within them the warmth of summer suns long since set. Her wings, folded carefully around her massive body, bore intricate patterns that looked almost like ancient script written in light itself. Even in sleep, the dragon radiated a power that made Elara's skin tingle with awareness. Elara moved closer, her heart beating steadily despite her awe. She reached the center of the chamber and stood before the sleeping dragon, feeling suddenly small and fragile. Yet she had come for a purpose, and the map of advancing shadows that weighed in her heart would not allow her to hesitate. She took a breath and began to sing. The words came from somewhere deep within her, somewhere connected to the magic that the forest creatures had shared. The melody rose and fell like wind through canyons, like water flowing through underground rivers, like the slow turning of the earth itself through seasons uncounted. The song filled the crystalline cavern, and the crystals themselves seemed to take it up, amplifying it, spreading it through the stone and stone and stone until the entire mountain resonated with the ancient tune. The dragon stirred. A low rumble began in her chest, a sound that was part growl and part sigh, as if the earth itself was waking from deep slumber. The great head lifted slowly, ancient muscles stretching and remembering their purpose. The massive jaws opened in a yawn that sent small cascades of crystal dust falling like luminous snow. Elara continued her song, watching as those legendary eyes began to flutter open. Within them burned the light of ages, the consciousness of centuries, the wisdom of a being who had watched empires rise and fall as though they were mere seasons. Those golden eyes, bright and aware and terrible in their power, turned toward the young princess who stood so bravely before her. As Embereth's golden eyes opened for the first time in 400 years, Elara felt the ground itself shift with renewed power. At dawn on the 7th day of gathering, all the creatures and mages stood in the circle of power at the mountain's peak. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Princess Elara moved through the assembled multitude, her steps careful and deliberate, feeling the weight of what was about to transpire. Around her stood beings of every kind. The great dragon Embereth with scales that caught the early light like burnished gold, the silver-furred Lumini with their knowing eyes that held centuries of wisdom, the human mages in their robes of deep blue and violet, and beside them the brave soldiers who had learned to trust in magic they could not fully understand. The morning mist clung to the mountainside, and from below came the distant sound of the Shadow Army's advance. Time was running out. The sorcerer Malachar's darkness had already consumed 3 villages, and the creeping veil continued its relentless march across the kingdom. But here, in this sacred space where Elara had brought them together, something unprecedented was about to unfold. She raised her hands, and the gathered assembly fell into perfect silence. Every creature, every being present, felt the magnetic pull of her intention. This was not a spell of conquest or dominion, but rather a binding of consent, a weaving together of individual wills into a singular purpose. Elara began to speak words in the ancient tongue, sounds that seemed to come not from her lips alone, but from somewhere deep within the earth itself. The silver stones beneath their feet began to glow with a soft luminescence. One by one, threads of light started to emerge from each participant, invisible threads that connected heart to heart. The dragon Embereth's golden aura intertwined with the crystalline light of the Lumini. The mage's purple essence spiraled together with the steadfast blue glow of the human soldiers. Elara stood at the center, her own light, a blend of pearl and rose flowing outward to embrace and bind them all. The binding required absolute trust, and in this moment, every being present chose that trust completely. There was no hesitation, no doubt. They had gathered through hardship and difficulty. They had learned to see past the differences that once divided them, and now they would prove that unity was not weakness but extraordinary strength. Elara's voice grew stronger, each word a crystalline note in a symphony of purpose. The threads of light began to spiral faster, weaving intricate patterns that seemed to defy the very fabric of reality. She felt their fears, their hopes, their determination flowing through her, and she channeled all of it into the spell. This was not her magic alone anymore. It belonged to all of them, born from their collective will. The circle began to rotate, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. The assembled creatures and soldiers felt themselves becoming part of something greater than themselves, yet more fully themselves than ever before. It was a paradox of existence, a moment where individuality and unity became one and the same. Then it happened. The spiral of light erupted outward from the peak of the mountain in a wave so brilliant that it seemed to turn night into day instantaneously. The silver light cascaded down the mountainside, spreading across forests and valleys, touching every corner of the kingdom. Where it passed, the land itself seemed to strengthen, to fortify itself against the encroaching darkness. The very earth became resistant to shadow magic. Every creature in the kingdom, whether present or far away, felt the surge of this unified purpose. Even those who could not see the light sensed its presence in their bones, in their spirits. The binding was complete, and it was magnificent beyond measure. Elara stood at the center of the assembly, her hands still raised, as the last waves of silver light spread outward from their mountain peak. She felt connected to every being present, their strengths now her strengths, their courage now amplified across the entire kingdom. In this moment, they were no longer separate. They were one force of light against the darkness. The light that emanated from their unified purpose was so brilliant that even the distant darkness seemed to pause in its advance. In her dreams, Elara walked through memories that were not her own, seeing through a heart consumed by grief and rage. The visions came to her in the crystalline chamber high within the Tower of Dawn, where moonlight filtered through ancient windows and cast silver patterns across the stone floor. She had fallen asleep beside the great glowing orb that contained fragments of Malachar's essence, gathered by the council of elder mages. Her breathing slowed, deepened, and suddenly she found herself standing in a place long forgotten by time. She saw a young man with kind eyes and gentle hands, moving through gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors. This was Malachar as he had been, before the shadow consumed him. His heart was open then, full of wonder and purpose. He had loved deeply, creating magic that healed and protected, that brought joy to everyone around him. In the visions, Elara felt the warmth of his genuine compassion, the weight of his responsibilities as a guardian of light, the fierce devotion he held for those closest to him. Then came the moment everything changed. A plague swept through the northern kingdoms, a darkness that even Malachar's most powerful magic could not stop. He watched helplessly as those he loved most withered and faded, their light extinguishing one by one. The grief was suffocating, an ocean without bottom or shore. Elara experienced it as though her own heart was breaking, felt the desperate clawing of a soul trying to hold onto something forever slipping away. The anger that followed was volcanic, consuming, transforming. He began to see light itself as a cruel illusion, a false hope that deceived people into believing they were safe when truly, everything and everyone would be taken from them. The visions showed his descent, like watching someone sink beneath dark water. His magic twisted, bending inward, becoming a tool of control rather than care. He told himself that if he could remake the world in shadow, if he could bind all living things together in one unified consciousness, then nothing could ever be torn apart again. No one would feel the agony of separation. All would be merged into one eternal whole where loss became impossible, because nothing was separate enough to be lost. Elara gasped as the visions released her, her eyes opening in the quiet chamber. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of understanding rather than despair. She saw now that Malachar had become a prisoner of his own sorrow, a once noble mage twisted by a pain so profound that it had rewritten his entire being. This knowledge did not excuse his actions, did not diminish the threat he posed, but it opened something new in her heart, a compassion that changed everything about how she understood the conflict ahead. She rose and walked to the window, gazing out across Ethermore where the brightness of the unified kingdom's light held back the darkness. The shadow army below was not made of monsters born from malice. Within those figures wrapped in darkness were beings who had perhaps also suffered loss, also felt desperation, also surrendered to the whisper that darkness was safer than hope. They were victims as much as weapons. Her strategy shifted in that moment. Victory through force alone would solve nothing. What was needed was a bridge, a way to remind those consumed by shadow that light was not an illusion but a choice. That pain, no matter how profound, did not have to define one's entire existence. That even a heart that had turned inward in protective darkness might still remember warmth. Elara descended the tower slowly, her footsteps echoing with new purpose. The vision of Malachar's anguished face lingered with her, not as justification but as reminder. Every shadow cast was once cast by someone who had chosen darkness, because they feared the light would betray them. Perhaps if she could help them see that their pain was witnessed, that their grief was valid, that redemption was still possible even after falling so far, perhaps then they could choose differently. She understood now that defeating Malachar meant more than victory in battle. It meant offering redemption to all who had been lost to shadow. The sky darkened as though night itself rushed forward to meet the morning, and the ground trembled with approaching footsteps. Elara stood at the edge of the fields of silver, her small army gathered behind her like a constellation of courage against the encroaching void. The crystalline grass beneath her feet began to dim, its natural luminescence fading as shadow crept across the expanse like spilled ink spreading through water. She could feel them before she saw them, thousands of dark forms moving as one terrible organism, a writhing mass of consumed creatures and corrupted spirits bound by Malachar's will. Her hand found the staff of starlight she had been given, and she raised it high. The motion was both deliberate and graceful, a gesture that seemed to call forth every ounce of hope that remained in Ethermore. Around her, the allied forces drew their weapons, not to strike with hatred, but to protect, to defend, to create space for light to flourish. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. When the shadow army reached them, the collision was not loud but profound. It was the meeting of two opposing forces so fundamental that reality itself seemed uncertain. Dark tendrils lashed out, seeking to coil around legs and arms, to drag defenders into the suffocating embrace of nothingness. But Elara had learned something precious in her time of preparation. She wove her magic not as a weapon of destruction, but as an offering. Each spell she cast became a beacon. Where her light touched the shadow creatures, something remarkable happened. They did not simply vanish. Instead, fragments of what they had once been flickered into existence. A glimpse of a deer before it became shadow, a swan mid-flight, a child's laugh before it was swallowed. She held these moments suspended in her magic, showing them what they had lost, what they could reclaim. Some of the shadow forms hesitated. Some began to fracture at their edges. Her allies fought around her with extraordinary courage. The woodland guardians moved with preternatural grace, their ancient magic complementing Elara's light. The crystal knights of the mountain realm held their formations steady, their armor reflecting every spell cast upon the fields. Even the smallest among them, the sprites and creatures of the deeper forests, held their ground, understanding that this battle would determine whether their homes would continue to exist. The shadow tide pressed harder, relentless and seemingly infinite. Elara felt the weight of it pressing against her consciousness, a sensation like drowning in darkness that had texture and hunger. But she did not retreat. Instead, she reached deeper into her newfound understanding. She began to combine her spells in ways she had never attempted before, interweaving threads of light with threads of compassion, creating patterns that dazzled and confused the shadow army's coordination. Then she felt him. Malachar's presence arrived like the dropping of temperature before a storm. The sorcerer materialized at the center of his army, a figure of such profound wrongness that merely perceiving him required a conscious effort not to look away. His form seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, human and not, solid and writhing, ancient and impossibly young. His eyes held centuries of corrupted magic. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, their gazes met. Elara felt the full weight of his malevolence, the immensity of his power, the desperation that had driven him to consume so much of the world. She could see it all in that moment: his fear of oblivion, his hunger for meaning, his terrible certainty that only dominion could bring him peace. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer him the same light she offered the corrupted creatures, but Malachar's form convulsed with what might have been rage or something deeper. He shrieked, a sound that was not entirely sound but something that struck at the very structure of existence, and his presence began to withdraw. The Shadow Army lost its coordination for vital seconds. That was enough. The Allies pressed forward with renewed determination, and the dark tide began, for the first time, to recede. As Malachar's dark form dissolved into shadows and fled eastward, Elara knew this was only the beginning of their true struggle. When Elara finally collapsed, it was not with dramatic finality, but with a quiet acceptance that even magic has limits. She had stood in the courtyard as dawn broke over Ethermoor, watching the last wisps of shadow dissipate into the mountain air like morning mist surrendering to sunlight. Her hands still trembled from the incantations she had woven through the night, spell after spell flowing from her lips and fingertips as though drawn from some infinite well within her chest. Only when the final enemy had retreated did her body seem to remember it was flesh and bone, blood and sinew, not merely a vessel for magical force. The walk to her chambers felt impossibly long. Each step echoed through the stone corridors like the fading heartbeat of the kingdom itself. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed immediately, their faces creasing with concern as they guided her toward the bed. Elara meant to assure them she merely needed rest, but the words would not come. Instead, she sank into the quilted depths of her mattress, still wearing her robes of battle, and sleep claimed her like a tide pulling her beneath its surface. 3 days passed in a blur of half-consciousness and strange dreams. Elara drifted through visions of crystalline mountains shattering into dust, of forests where trees whispered in voices she almost understood. She woke occasionally to find healers pressing cool cloths to her forehead, servants offering cups of broth that tasted of honey and herbs. Her body felt impossibly heavy, as though she had been carved from stone. Even lifting her head required a concentration that seemed disproportionate to the effort. On the 4th morning, her chief advisor Aldrin requested entry to her chamber. He was an elderly man whose silver beard fell past his shoulders, his eyes holding the weight of decades spent in service to the crown. He did not approach with false cheerfulness or empty reassurances. Instead, he sat beside her bed and spoke with the gentle firmness of one accustomed to delivering difficult truths. Magic, he explained, was not separate from the body but woven through it like gold thread in tapestry. When one casts spells of such magnitude and number, when one poured so much of one's own essence into the weaving of power, the physical form demanded repayment. Rest was not indulgence but necessity. Pushing forward in this state would not strengthen her but weaken her, leaving her vulnerable to illness or worse. Elara wanted to argue. She could feel Malachar's presence lingering in the eastern reaches of the realm, his shadow army regrouping and reforming. Every day of stillness felt like allowing him to gain ground, like betraying the people who looked to her for protection. But when she attempted to rise, the room tilted around her, and she found herself sinking back into the pillows with a gasp of frustration. Over the following days, as strength gradually returned to her limbs, Elara began to understand what Aldrin had been teaching her without words. Magic was not an unlimited resource to be drawn upon without consequence. The most powerful sorcerers throughout Ethermoor's history were those who had learned to respect their own limitations, who understood that preservation of power was as important as its wielding. Strength was not merely the ability to cast the mightiest spell, but the wisdom to know when rest was itself an act of courage. She spent hours looking out her window at the kingdom spread below, watching the people move about their days. They did not know how close she had come to pushing herself into something irreversible. They simply knew that she had fought, that the shadow had retreated. That was enough for them, and slowly it became enough for her. By the 10th day, Elara could walk to her window without assistance. By the 12th, she could stand in the courtyard for brief periods, feeling the sun's warmth returning to her skin like an old friend. The magical exhaustion did not vanish completely, but transformed into something manageable, a constant, gentle reminder of her own humanity. She understood now that Malachar would test her again, that greater battles lay ahead. But she also understood something perhaps more valuable, that surviving those battles would require not just power but patience, not just strength but the wisdom to recover. Lying in her chamber as moonlight streamed through the windows, Elara whispered a prayer for strength to continue when she rose again. The healing gardens existed in a pocket of eternal spring, where time moved differently and wounds of body and spirit could mend. As Elara was gently carried through the shimmering gateway by the healing mages, she felt the weight of her recent struggles beginning to lift from her shoulders like morning mist burning away beneath a gentle sun. The air itself seemed different here, warmer and infused with a sweetness that reminded her of honey and starlight combined, carrying promises of restoration and peace. The garden sprawled before her in impossible beauty. Luminous flowers bloomed in colors that seemed to exist only in dreams, petals of soft violet that glowed with inner light, blooms of silver and pearl that chimed softly when the breeze moved through them. The vines that wound around ancient stone arches whispered words in languages that predated kingdoms, their leaves shimmering with each syllable. Crystal-clear streams flowed in meandering paths, their waters catching light and refracting it into gentle rainbows that painted the ground beneath her feet. The senior healer, an ancient woman whose silver hair moved as though underwater, guided Elara to a pavilion woven entirely from living willow branches. Here, Elara was invited to rest on beds of moss so soft they seemed to embrace her body. The healers brought her infusions brewed from flowers that existed nowhere else in Ethermore, each sip filling her with warmth and gradually dissolving the knots of tension she had carried for so long. As she drank, she felt clarity returning to her mind, the fog of exhaustion and fear slowly clearing. Each day in the gardens brought new discoveries. Elara learned that the luminous flowers were ancient guardians of vitality, and by sitting quietly among them, one could feel their energy gently restoring balance. The whispering vines taught her that healing was not a passive state, but an active conversation between the wounded and the world itself. The healers explained that true strength came not from endless battle, but from knowing when to rest, when to allow others to care for you, when to let the land itself renew your spirit. She met other healers within the gardens, men and women of all ages who had dedicated their lives to restoration rather than destruction. There was Thuron, a gentle healer who taught her that magic could be expressed through touch and presence, through the simple act of sitting with someone in their pain. There was Lissa, a healer who worked with the plants themselves, singing to them in a language that made flowers bloom and fruits ripen. These healers showed Elara that magic was far more vast and beautiful than the power struggles and battles that had consumed so much of her attention. They taught her that creation was as much a magical act as protection, that growth and healing required just as much courage as facing darkness. As her strength gradually returned, Elara spent her days walking deeper into the gardens, discovering groves where the air shimmered with healing magic so potent it was almost visible. In these sacred places, she meditated on everything she had learned about herself, about the burden of being a princess, about the cost of the war that raged beyond these peaceful walls. The gardens seemed to hold her thoughts gently, neither judging nor demanding, simply allowing her to process and understand. The nights in the gardens were perhaps most magical of all. Bioluminescent creatures emerged as twilight fell, their gentle glow creating an enchanted landscape of soft light and shadow. Elara would lie beneath the stars, feeling the heartbeat of the land itself, sensing the deep magic that flowed through root and stone and water. She came to understand that the darkness threatening Ethermore was not invincible, that light and growth would always persist, finding ways to flourish even in the most challenging circumstances. When Elara emerged from the gardens after 7 days, she felt reborn, and the path forward seemed illuminated by new understanding. The great halls of the castle filled with the languages and colors of a dozen different lands, each bearing witness to the spreading darkness. Princess Elara stood at the threshold of the grand chamber, watching as emissaries from distant kingdoms moved through the cavernous space like ships navigating an uncertain sea. Silk banners in crimson, gold, and emerald hung from the vaulted ceiling, each one representing a realm she had only read about in ancient texts. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Elara felt the weight of expectation settle upon her shoulders, yet it was a different weight now. After her 7 days of renewal in the secret gardens, she carried herself with a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within her soul. The exhaustion that had threatened to consume her had transformed into purposeful determination. As she entered the hall, the assembled representatives turned toward her. There was the tall ambassador from the northern reaches, his frost-blue cloak still bearing traces of snow from the mountain passes. Beside him stood the graceful emissary from the Coral Kingdoms, her scaled armor shimmering like pearl in the soft light. From the eastern provinces came warriors of legend, their eyes reflecting the wisdom of ages. Even the reclusive people of the twilight forests had sent delegates, beings who rarely ventured beyond their own shadowed groves. Each had come bearing the same urgent message. The shadows of Malachar's curse were creeping across their borders with relentless inevitability. Villages disappeared into darkness. The light itself seemed to flee before the advancing corruption. Yet they had also come bearing something more precious than warnings. They had come with hope. One by one, they stepped forward to speak of their struggles and their determination to resist. The northern ambassador described how entire valleys had been swallowed by unnatural twilight, how his people had begun to despair, until word reached them of a young princess who had stood against the darkness and found the strength to endure. The coral emissary spoke of how the very waters of their realm had grown cold and strange, but how the knowledge that others fought alongside them rekindled the fire in their hearts. As Elara listened to their testimonies, she felt something profound shifting within the chamber itself. It was as though the very stones beneath them were responding to the collective resolve gathered here. The light streaming through the windows seemed to intensify, becoming almost golden in its warmth. The crystalline walls of Ethermore, which had felt so fragile and vulnerable just days before, now seemed to pulse with ancient power, strengthened by the unity of purpose that filled the space. She moved among them, speaking softly but with unmistakable conviction. She spoke of what she had learned in those days of solitude and meditation. She spoke of how darkness was not merely the absence of light, but something that could be transformed through courage and connection. She told them that Malachar's shadow thrived on isolation and despair, on the belief that each kingdom stood alone against an overwhelming force. But here in this hall stood proof that they were not alone. Throughout the day, as formal pacts were signed with ink made from starlight, as ancient magical practitioners combined their knowledge to formulate new strategies of defense, the atmosphere in the hall continued to shift. What had begun as a gathering of desperate allies slowly transformed into something altogether different. It became a true alliance, forged not in fear, but in shared vision of what they would preserve and protect together. Elara moved to the great window overlooking the gardens where she had found her renewal. Below, the crystalline peaks of Ethermore caught the afternoon sun and threw brilliant light across the landscape. She thought of all the creatures and peoples who depended on the continuation of this light, this magic, this world they all cherished. The representatives gathered around her, their diverse faces united in solemn determination. One by one, they placed their hands over their hearts in gestures both foreign and sacred, each in the tradition of their own people, all speaking words of commitment and solidarity. As the representatives pledged their support, Elara understood that defending Ethermore meant defending the entire world from eternal night. The scrying pool showed them something they had not expected, not a person controlling the darkness, but a place, a wound in the world itself. Elara leaned closer to the shimmering surface of the ancient pool, her reflection fragmented in the rippling water. Around her, the council chamber fell into profound silence. The pool's depths swirled with twilight colors, shifting between deep purples and sickly greens, and within that churning mist, a tower became visible. Not a tower of stone or mortar, but something far more sinister, a structure of compressed shadow and crystallized darkness, standing at the edge of the world where reality itself seemed to fray. The wizard Aldwin placed a weathered hand upon her shoulder, his voice a careful whisper. The discovery before them changed everything they had planned. What they had believed to be Malachar's seat of power was merely an extension, a tentacle of something far older and more terrible. The true source of the Shadow Army's endless strength originated not from the sorcerer's will, but from this nexus, this wound that bled darkness into their world like poison seeping through cloth. Elara watched as the scrying magic drew closer to the tower, descending through layers of shadow until the pool revealed a chamber within. There, suspended in absolute darkness, hung something that defied description. It was not solid, yet not entirely ethereal, a pulsing mass that seemed to consume light itself, drawing it inward with a hunger that had existed since before kingdoms rose or fell. This was the nexus of darkness, the anchor point that tethered Malachar and his shadow army to this realm. As long as it endured, the darkness would continue to spread. As long as it thrummed with power, no amount of sword strikes or spell casting could truly defeat the threat. The Shadow Army would regenerate, reform, and return. Malachar would remain bound to this world, drawing strength from an inexhaustible source. The realization settled over Elara like winter frost. This was the true battle, the genuine purpose of her journey. The tower stood at the obsidian edge, where the crystalline mountains descended into mist and nothing existed beyond but void. To reach it would require passage through terrain that no kingdom had successfully traversed in living memory. The path wound through the shattered lands, where magic itself had fractured into wild, unpredictable currents. Entire armies had attempted the crossing in centuries past, and none had returned to tell of success. Yet they could not ignore what the pool had revealed. Elara understood now why Malachar had pushed so relentlessly outward, why his armies seemed endless and tireless. He fed them from the nexus, replenishing their ranks as quickly as they fell. To end this war, they would need to breach the tower, navigate its shadowed halls, and destroy the nexus itself. It would require sacrifice. It would demand everything from those brave enough to attempt it. She turned from the pool to face the assembled council, and in their eyes, she saw the same understanding reflected back. The pledges they had made moments before now carried weight they had not fully comprehended. Defending Ethermore meant more than defending castles and villages. It meant sending a force to the world's edge, to a place where shadow had ruled unchallenged since the beginning of ages. It meant walking willingly into darkness deeper than night. Aldwin began speaking of preparation, of gathering the strongest warriors, the most gifted mages, those whose hearts burned brightest with courage and light. The council members nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the task. Yet Elara's attention remained fixed on the scrying pool, watching as the tower faded back into mist and shadow. She could see it clearly now in her mind's eye, that structure of compressed darkness waiting at the world's edge. She thought of her kingdom, of every child sleeping peacefully beneath stars that might otherwise never shine again. She thought of the whispering forests and the crystalline mountains, of all the magic and beauty that filled Ethermore. And she thought of the cost if they failed, if the nexus continued beating like a dark heart at the center of everything. Elara knew then that the final battle would not be fought on any field, but in the very heart of shadow, where light had never ventured. The eastern lands were unrecognizable, twisted by shadow into nightmarish landscapes that seemed to defy nature itself. Where once golden meadows had swayed beneath gentle breezes, now the ground lay cracked and barren, yielding only thorns of blackened stone. The sky above hung low and gray, pressing down upon the small company like a suffocating blanket woven from despair itself. Yet onward they traveled, for there was no turning back now. Elara rode upon Solaris, whose magnificent wings folded close to his body as they moved through the corrupted terrain. The griffin's golden eyes remained alert, ever scanning the twisted landscape for dangers both seen and unseen. Behind them, Embereth the dragon moved with surprising grace despite her enormous size, her crimson scales catching what little light remained in this forsaken place. The dragon had grown quieter with each passing day, as though the very air of these corrupted lands weighed upon her ancient spirit. Sylvanus, the wolf sage, padded alongside them with his silver fur seeming to glow faintly in the darkness. He was the first to sense disturbances in the magical currents that flowed through Ethermoor, and his warnings had saved them from countless shadow creatures that prowled these desolate wastes. Lord Thorin, steadfast and unwavering as always, rode his white horse with one hand upon his sword and the other clutching the sacred crystal that Elara had entrusted to his keeping. This crystal was their beacon, their anchor to the light that still dwelled within Ethermoor's heart. They came upon a village that had once been thriving. Now it stood as a monument to Malachar's cruelty, its buildings hollowed out like broken shells, its streets empty save for the whispers of shadows. Yet as they moved through carefully, they found survivors. An old woman trembled in a cellar. A child, no more than 5 winters old, hid beneath the rubble of what had once been a home. A blacksmith with a grieving face emerged from the darkness, his eyes hollow with loss. Elara knelt before each of them, speaking words of comfort and hope. She shared what provisions they could spare, though their journey ahead would be long and demanding. She did not promise them that Malachar would be defeated, for she had learned that empty promises ring hollow in times of darkness. Instead, she spoke of purpose, of the light that endured even in the deepest shadow, of the magic that bound all living things together. The old woman wept. The child clutched the small crystalline pendant Elara pressed into her palm. The blacksmith straightened his shoulders, finding strength he thought lost. As they left that broken village behind, Thorin rode close to Elara. "You give them hope, princess, when you have no guarantee of victory for yourself," he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of concern, the voice of one who had known her since childhood. "That is precisely why I must give them hope," Elara replied, her eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon where storm clouds gathered like a bruise upon the world. "For if we who walk toward the darkness lose faith in the light, what hope remains for those we leave behind?" Embereth rumbled low, a sound like distant thunder, and Sylvanus increased his pace. They could all sense it now, a thrumming in the very fabric of reality. The obsidian tower was near, the seat of Malachar's power, the source of the shadow that bled across their beloved realm like spilled ink upon parchment. The air grew colder with each breath. The shadows took on more defined shapes, more purposeful movements. Yet as the company pressed forward, something remarkable began to happen. The sacred crystal that Thorin carried began to emit a faint luminescence, soft as moonlight filtering through water. Solaris and Embereth drew closer instinctively, and even Sylvanus's silver fur seemed to gather and hold that gentle light. It did not drive back the darkness completely, but it created a space of warmth and clarity amid the corruption, a sphere of possibility within the realm of despair. As the obsidian tower rose before them like a spike of corrupted starlight, Elara felt both terror and the unwavering certainty of her purpose. The tower's interior was vast beyond possibility, a labyrinth of shadow and whispered temptations that sought to divide and break them. Elara's companions were pulled away one by one, their hands slipping from hers as invisible currents drew them into separate passages. She called out to them, but her voice dissolved into the obsidian walls, swallowed by a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The air grew colder, denser, until each breath felt like drawing in liquid darkness. The passages twisted and reformed around her, leading her deeper into chambers she had never seen before, yet somehow recognized. The walls began to glow with a sickly luminescence, and within them, images took shape. Visions unfolded before her, like petals opening on a poisoned flower. She saw herself failing. In one vision, she stood in the ruins of her kingdom. The crystalline spires crumbled to dust, the people she loved scattered and broken. In another, she knelt before Malachar, her will shattered, her purpose consumed by his darkness. The visions multiplied, overlapping, showing her infinite ways she could fall, infinite futures where her courage proved insufficient. A child Elara watched from the shadow of a vision, asking with Elara's own voice, "What if you are not strong enough? What if your love for them becomes their weakness? What if your very presence draws the darkness closer?" The questions coiled around her mind like serpents, whispering doubt into the spaces between her thoughts. She stumbled forward through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, and the visions grew more terrible. She saw her closest advisors turn to shadow. She saw the forests of Ethermore burned black. She saw the light itself retreating, leaving only an endless void. But then something shifted within her, a small, quiet thing at first, like the first star appearing in a twilight sky. She stopped walking and turned to face the visions directly. She looked into the eyes of each failed version of herself, each broken future, each nightmare made manifest. And she saw something she had not noticed before. In every vision, no matter how dark, there existed a choice point, a moment where things might have turned differently. The darkness was not inevitable. It was merely possible. Elara walked toward the nearest vision, her steps steady. She reached out her hand and touched the shimmering surface of the image, showing her kingdom in ruins. The vision rippled and fragmented under her touch, dissolving like frost meeting sunlight. Another vision crumbled, and another. The tower seemed to shudder around her, as if surprised by her defiance. But Elara continued forward, no longer running from the shadows or stumbling through them. She moved through them with purpose, acknowledging each fear, each failure, each possibility of defeat, and releasing it. She did not deny the darkness or pretend it held no power. Instead, she recognized it for what it truly was, a reflection of what could be, not what must be. The chamber walls began to crack, pale light seeping through the fissures. The visions faded, no longer able to maintain their grip on someone who had accepted them and chosen to transcend them. The air grew warmer, the weight lifting from her shoulders like a burden finally set down. Elara found herself standing in a circular chamber at the tower's heart. Here, the darkness was not hostile but neutral, simply the absence of light. And standing in that neutrality, she felt the presence of her true purpose, crystalline and unshakable. She understood now that her strength did not come from invulnerability or from the certainty that she would never fail. It came from her willingness to face failure, to witness darkness, and to choose light despite knowing its fragility. The door before her swung open, revealing the staircase that descended back to the world below. Her companions would be waiting, each carrying their own trials, their own transformations. She would rejoin them with clarity they could feel radiating from her like warmth. When Elara emerged from her trial chamber, she carried no doubts, only the crystalline resolve of one who had stared into the abyss and refused to look away. Malachar stood silhouetted against a window overlooking a world of his own making. And when he turned to face her, Elara saw not a monster but a man made of sorrow. His eyes held centuries of loneliness, each wrinkle on his ancient face a map of pain she could almost taste in the air between them. The tower trembled with anticipation as Elara climbed those final spiral steps, her heart steady, her breath even. She had expected rage. She had prepared for unleashed magic that would shake the very foundations of reality. Instead, Malachar simply watched her approach with an expression that looked almost like relief. The shadows that clung to him like second skin seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a broken heart. When she reached the pinnacle chamber, she saw his hands were shaking, not with anger, but with the weight of endless years carrying his burden alone. The darkness that swirled around him was not born of pure malice, but of desperation, of a man who had forgotten how to exist in the light after so long in the shadows. The magic that erupted between them was unlike anything Elara had imagined. It was not the clash of opposing forces in simple combat, but rather a dance of profound understanding. Light and shadow wove through one another in the air, creating patterns that seemed to contain entire conversations, entire lifetimes of choice and consequence. Her white magic did not seek to destroy the darkness, but to illuminate it, to show what lay beneath the corruption. Malachar's power was immense, drawn from sources so ancient they predated the current kingdoms of Ethermore. Yet with each spell he cast, each shadow he flung toward her, Elara responded not with destruction but with compassion. She wove her light into his darkness, creating twilight where there had been only night. Her magic was asking a question rather than making a demand. Could you remember who you were before the isolation claimed you? The sorcerer fell to his knees, not from magical defeat but from emotional overwhelm. Tears streamed down his face as the memories surfaced. Centuries ago, he had been a scholar, a seeker of knowledge who simply wanted to understand the world. He had loved deeply, lost devastatingly, and rather than face that grief, he had chosen darkness. Each shadow he created was a wall against feeling anything at all. Elara descended those final steps with an open hand extended. She did not speak of his crimes or the suffering he had caused. Instead, she said the words that broke through all his defenses: I forgive you. Not because your actions were forgivable, but because you are human, and humans deserve the chance to become something better than their worst moments. The magic around them shifted entirely. The tower that had been singing with dark power began to hum with a different frequency. Malachar looked at her hand as though it were the most precious thing he had ever seen. His entire body convulsed as he released the grief he had been holding for centuries, letting it flow out of him in waves of shadow that dissipated into the air. For the first time in longer than memory, Malachar chose light. It was not a dramatic transformation, but a gentle one, like dawn breaking across mountains after an endless night. His form, which had been twisted and corrupted by dark magic, began to straighten. The shadows that had become his very essence started to release their hold on his essence. In that moment of acceptance, the sorcerer's shadow form began to dissolve, not into nothing, but into light. The tower crumbled like a thing suddenly awakened to its own wrongness, and the darkness that had seemed eternal began to fracture. Stones that had stood for countless ages split like ancient ice beneath spring's warmth. The great obsidian pillars that formed the nexus of darkness trembled and groaned, their surfaces beginning to glow with a luminescence that spread outward like veins of molten gold through black marble. The shadow army that had terrorized the kingdoms of Ethermore for so long started to dissolve, wisps of dark smoke curling upward and dissipating into nothing. Elara stood at the heart of the collapsing tower, her hands joined with those of her dearest companions. The wizard Thorn gripped her left hand with surprising warmth for one so ancient, his silver eyes blazing with purpose. To her right, the warrior queen Isolde held firm, her strength a steady anchor against the waves of releasing magic. Behind them stood the forest Spritler, the dragon Nightcale, and the mortal healer Mara, all connected through threads of glowing light that Elara could see binding them together like constellations. The magic required was almost unbearable. It poured through Elara's body like liquid starlight, burning and freezing simultaneously. Every breath felt like drawing in crystalline air that expanded within her chest. She could feel the enormity of what they were doing, the collective power of every person she had ever helped, every kindness she had shown returning to her now, magnified 1,000-fold. The kingdoms beyond the tower's walls needed them. The innocent people of Ethermore, the creatures of the whispering forests, the families huddled in their homes, all of them depended upon this moment. She opened her mouth and began to sing. It was not a song with words, but something far older, a melody that existed in the space between breath and heartbeat. Her companions joined her, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to make the very air shimmer. The sound traveled outward from the tower in waves of pure light, rolling across the crystalline mountains like dawn breaking across a sleeping world. Where the light touched shadow, the darkness yielded. It did not fight back. It seemed almost relieved to be released from its burden of wrongness. Across all of Ethermore, from the highest peaks to the deepest valleys, the shadow army simply ceased to be. The figures that had once inspired terror and despair evaporated like morning mist, leaving behind only clear air and the promise of a new day. The tower's collapse accelerated. Massive sections of wall fell away, but Elara and her companions did not move. They remained connected, channeling the destructive power outward, transforming it into something that could heal rather than harm. She could feel the magic finding the places where shadows had embedded themselves in the land itself, in the soil and stone, in the hearts of those who had lost hope. Slowly, gently, it began to mend those wounds. Thorn's voice grew stronger, and Elara felt him drawing upon decades of accumulated wisdom. Isold's grip tightened with a warrior's determination. Lur hummed with the ancient power of the forests themselves. Kale's dragon song resonated like thunder made beautiful and purposeful. Mara's healing magic wove through it all like silver thread, binding everything together. The tower around them became translucent, barely there at all. The darkness that had powered Malachar's reign was not destroyed so much as transformed, converted into pure light and released back into the world. Elara could see beyond the collapsing stone to the lands beyond, could see the shadow army vanishing like a bad dream. The kingdoms were awakening. The sun was rising over Ethermore for the first time in what felt like forever. And then it was finished. The tower crumbled to dust that seemed to catch the light and become something beautiful. Her companions released her hands, and Elara felt herself sinking, exhausted beyond measure, but also more herself than she had ever been. As the last of the shadow dissipated beneath the rising sun, Elara felt both a profound emptiness and an indescribable lightness. The gates of the castle stood open, and the people of Ethermore waited beneath skies that were clear for the first time in months. Elara's heart swelled as she approached on horseback, the morning light catching the silver threads woven through her traveling cloak. Behind her rode her companions, each bearing the marks of their journey but radiating an unmistakable peace. The shadows that had consumed this realm were gone, dissolved like mist before dawn, and in their absence something precious was being born anew. As she drew closer, a gentle murmur rose from the gathered crowd. Children who had been born in darkness pressed forward, their wide eyes taking in the princess they had heard whispered about in hiding places and cellars. The older folk wept openly, remembering a time before the shadow, before fear had wrapped itself around every waking moment. Elara dismounted slowly, deliberately, wanting them to see her not as some distant figure on horseback, but as one of them, as a guardian who had walked through the darkness alongside them. The kingdom was not as she had left it. The marble pathways were cracked from neglect, and many buildings bore scorch marks where shadow creatures had clawed at stone and wood. Yet something miraculous was already unfolding. In the courtyards and gardens, green shoots were breaking through soil that had been barren for so long. Vines were creeping up damaged walls as if the land itself was remembering how to grow, how to reclaim what had been stolen. The air itself felt different now, carrying within it not merely the absence of shadow but the genuine presence of hope. As Elara walked among the ruins of her home, she could see the spirit of her people rising to meet her. Merchants were setting up modest stalls, selling vegetables they had salvaged and preserved. Builders were already planning repairs, their voices carrying notes of determination rather than despair. Children played in the courtyards, their laughter a sound that had been nearly extinct just days before. The contrast was almost too much to bear, so profound was the transformation. The creatures of Ethermore came next, emerging from the forests and mountains in slow procession. The silver wolves descended from the crystalline peaks, their eyes reflecting ancient wisdom. The great hawks circled overhead, their cries no longer mournful but triumphant. Even the smallest forest folk emerged, the rabbits and foxes and shy deer stepping cautiously into the light. Each being seemed to bow in their own way, not to pay homage to a ruler but to acknowledge a sister who had fought at their side, who had carried their hopes through the deepest darkness. Elara stood before the great throne room, where once her father had ruled, and where the shadow had attempted to twist the very heart of the kingdom. The throne itself remained, covered in a fine dust but unbroken. She could have sat upon it then, claimed the formal title that was rightfully hers. But instead, she chose to remain standing in the courtyard, surrounded by her people and the magical creatures of her realm. This felt truer somehow, more honest to what they had all become. As the sun reached its zenith, Elara addressed the gathering. Her voice was young but steady, carrying within it a maturity that had been earned through trials that few could comprehend. She spoke of the journey not to glorify herself but to honor those who had endured in darkness, those who had maintained hope when shadows pressed against every window and door. She spoke of her companions, of the sacrifices made, of the magic that had ultimately prevailed not through force but through the will to protect and preserve. The old scholars came forward with ancient texts, offering to teach her the true histories of Ethermore, the old magic that predated even the shadow's first stirrings. The warrior clans pledged their swords not for conquest but for protection. The healers brought forth their herbs and remedies to tend to wounds both visible and hidden. And Elara received it all with grace, understanding that leadership was not about commanding from a distance, but about standing present with her people as they rebuilt. As Elara walked among her people, accepting their gratitude and their love, she understood that true victory was not the absence of darkness, but the choice to kindle light in its place. The first school of magic welcomed its students on the spring equinox, a day of perfect balance between light and shadow. Elara stood at the entrance of the newly constructed academy, its walls built from stones that had been carefully chosen from both the crystalline mountains and the healed shadowlands, a physical testament to unity and reconciliation. The morning sun caught the facets of the crystal stones, casting dancing rainbows across the courtyard where young humans, fairies, and creatures of every magical persuasion gathered with their parents. She watched as a small fairy child clutched her mother's hand while staring up at the towering doorway with wonder in her luminous eyes. A young human boy whispered excitedly to his father about the classes he hoped to take. These simple moments, these ordinary scenes of hope and anticipation, meant far more to Elara than any battle one could ever mean. Over the months that followed, Elara moved through her kingdom with purpose and warmth. She established schools of magic not just in the capital, but throughout Ethermore, in remote villages and bustling trade centers alike. She wanted every child who possessed even a spark of magical talent to have the opportunity to learn, to grow, to understand their gifts. The teachers included reformed shadow mages who had chosen to turn away from Malachar's influence, wise elders from the woodland kingdoms, and brave human scholars who had studied magic in secret for generations. But schools were only the beginning. Elara worked tirelessly to establish treaties of peace between the kingdoms that had once viewed each other with suspicion or fear. The dragon lords of the eastern peaks agreed to trade precious gems for grain from the western plains. The mer kingdoms opened their waterways to merchant ships, establishing safe passage and mutual commerce. The forest dwellers and the mountain dwellers, ancient rivals, found common ground in the shared desire for a stable, thriving world. Beyond the grand political arrangements, Elara created something perhaps more important: systems of mutual aid that wove the fabric of her kingdom together. Villages now helped villages through harsh winters. Skilled craftspeople shared their knowledge with those eager to learn. When blight threatened the southern crops, harvesters from the north traveled to help replant and restore. Magic was no longer hoarded as a tool of power, but shared as a gift for the collective good. She moved through markets and farmlands, through schools and council chambers, listening more than she spoke. The people came to understand that their young queen possessed wisdom that seemed to exceed her years, yet she never spoke with arrogance. She asked questions. She genuinely wanted to understand the concerns of shepherds and scholars, merchants and mages. When mistakes were made, she acknowledged them openly and worked to find better solutions. The transformation of Ethermore happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the slow shift from winter to spring. The shadowlands that had once been barren and blighted began to bloom again as magic healed the earth. Flowers emerged from soil that had known only darkness. Creatures returned to forests that had been silent. The wound in the world was closing, not erased but transformed into something that reminded all who saw it of their capacity for redemption and renewal. Elara herself changed in subtle ways. The weight of responsibility never left her shoulders, but it became familiar, something she carried with grace rather than burden. She laughed more easily. She slept deeper and longer. The nightmares of battle and shadow faded, replaced by dreams of possibility and growth. On quiet evenings, she would walk through the palace gardens that had been replanted with flowers from every corner of her kingdom. Each bloom represented a different realm, a different people, a different voice in the chorus of Ethermore's new song. She would breathe in the mingled fragrances and feel the gentle magic that thrummed through the earth beneath her feet. Elara stood in the tower's highest chamber, watching the sun set over a kingdom at peace, and she smiled knowing that the real work was just beginning. The man who had once been the sorcerer Malachar tended to the luminous flowers with gentle hands, his face finally showing peace. Around him stretched the healing gardens, a sanctuary where magic flowed like invisible water through soil and stem, where colors bloomed that existed nowhere else in all of Ethermore. The petals shifted between shades of silver and gold as the afternoon light filtered through the ancient trees overhead, casting everything in a dream-soft glow. Elara approached along the winding path, her footsteps quiet against the moss-covered stones. She had come to visit him again, as she so often did these days, drawn to the unexpected comfort of his presence and the wisdom that seemed to seep from him like sap from ancient bark. The transformation had been gradual. When the darkness had finally left him, when the shadow magic had been stripped away by the combined light of the kingdom's united magic, Malachar had simply knelt in the dust and wept. But these were not the tears of defeat or despair. These were the tears of someone finally released from a prison of their own making. Now he spent his days here among the flowers, teaching others about the garden's secrets, about the delicate balance between growth and decay, between seasons of bloom and seasons of rest. He had refused any position of power or authority. He wanted only to tend, to nurture, to help things grow. It was, he had told Elara once, the only form of magic he wished to practice anymore. The princess found him kneeling beside a patch of moonlight blossoms, their petals luminescent even in daylight. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes, once so filled with hunger for power and darkness, now held only gentleness and something like gratitude. "Your Highness," he said, rising to his feet with a slight wince. His body had aged in its long years of darkness, and it would not fully recover. But he bore this gracefully, seeing it as a reminder rather than a burden. Elara smiled and reached out to touch his shoulder, a gesture of affection that had become natural between them. To most of the kingdom, this friendship seemed impossible, incomprehensible even. How could the princess trust the man who had once threatened everything she held dear? But Elara had learned something profound during the darkness. That redemption was not a myth. It was real, and it was possible, even for those who had fallen the farthest. They walked together through the gardens, moving slowly, allowing the magic of the place to seep into their bones. Malachar spoke of the garden's needs, of which sections required the gentle touch of rain magic and which needed rest. He spoke of the delicate flowers that bloomed only once every 100 years, flowers whose names had been forgotten by all but him. His words were like the gardens themselves, healing, restorative, full of quiet wonder. "The kingdom thrives," Elara told him. "The rebuilding continues. The people are learning to live without fear, because you lead them forward," Malachar said. "Not by force, not by pretending the darkness never existed, but by showing them that light can come even after the deepest shadow. You give them permission to heal." As the sun moved lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of amber and rose, they sat on a stone bench carved from moonlit marble. Elara found herself studying the man beside her, this impossible friend, this living proof that nothing was beyond redemption. The sorcerer who had once sought to consume the kingdom now spent his days coaxing beauty from the earth. She thought of all the people she had known who had wanted vengeance upon him, who had argued that some darkness was too deep to heal. They had been wrong, not because Malachar deserved easy forgiveness, but because everyone deserved the chance to become something different, something better. The twilight deepened around them, and the garden flowers began to glow with their own inner light, as if the magic itself was responding to the falling darkness with radiance. It was beautiful and perfect and peaceful. When Elara asked him how he could forgive himself, he simply pointed to the blooming gardens and said, "We all grow where we are planted when given the chance." A year had passed since the darkness fell, and now, beneath stars that shone brighter than ever before, Elara stood to share the final truth of her journey. The great amphitheater of Ethermore was filled to overflowing, with creatures of every kind gathered in the soft glow of enchanted lanterns. Elves and humans sat side by side. Dwarves from the Crystal Mountains stood shoulder to shoulder with the graceful beings of the Whispering Forests. Even the Sky Realm ambassadors had descended on gossamer wings to witness this momentous gathering. The princess moved slowly to the center of the stone circle, her golden gown catching the starlight as she walked. Her eyes, once shadowed with worry and the weight of impossible choices, now held a quiet clarity. Behind her, the magnificent castle of Ethermore rose like a beacon, its towers illuminated by the gentle magic that now flowed freely through the realm once more. The darkness that had threatened to consume everything had become nothing more than a memory, a cautionary tale whispered to remind all who heard it of how fragile peace truly is. Elara began to speak, her voice carrying effortlessly across the gathered multitudes through ancient magic that had been restored to its proper purpose. She spoke of the journey that had brought them all to this moment, not glossing over the difficult passages but honoring each one. She spoke of those who had fallen, whose sacrifice had woven the foundation of this peace. She spoke of the fear that had gripped every heart when Malachar's shadow army first emerged, when it seemed that all light might be extinguished from the world forever. But she also spoke of something deeper, something that the darkness had tried to crush but could never truly reach. She spoke of the magic that flows through all living things, the magic of connection, of hope, of choosing to see the best in one another even when darkness whispers that surrender would be easier. She reminded them that magic itself is not wielded through force or domination, but through the bonds we forge with those around us, through understanding and compassion. The princess turned slowly, addressing each kingdom and realm in turn. To the humans, she spoke of their resilience and their capacity to love fiercely in the face of overwhelming odds. To the elves, she acknowledged their ancient wisdom that had guided so many through the shadowed times. To the dwarves, she honored their unshakable courage and the strength they had shown in defending their mountain homes. To every being present, she spoke of their irreplaceable role in the tapestry of Ethermore's salvation. Then her voice grew more gentle, more introspective. She spoke of the ongoing work ahead, the truth that victory does not mean the end of struggle. Vigilance, she said, is the eternal price of freedom. The darkness had been vanquished, but there would always be shadows in the hearts of those who chose to harbor them. There would always be those who might be tempted by the promise of power at others' expense. The real victory was not in defeating Malachar, she explained, but in choosing every single day to turn toward the light rather than be drawn to shadow. She spoke of forgiveness too, of how the gardens were already blooming again because people were willing to give themselves and others the chance to grow. She spoke of redemption and healing, of how magic itself was meant to be a gift of connection, not a weapon of control. As she concluded her address, the stars seemed to grow even brighter, casting their light across every face turned toward her. Elara raised her hand in blessing, and a gentle wave of pure light rippled outward, touching every heart present. In that moment, each being felt the profound truth of her words, not as mere language but as lived experience resonating through their very being. In every heart that carries light, in every act of kindness and forgiveness, the victory is eternal, and the darkness shall never rise again.